And so what I tried to do was, as I said, there are 200 biases.
Yep.
And what I tried to do was systematize 75 of those into a framework that I called the perimeters traps, because there are 10 of them, and that's a mnemonic that symbolizes how we think in a bounded manner, or how narrowly we think. So each of these traps has 6 or 7 of these predictable biases that advisors might be aware of, and each of those, of course, is a source of misinformation. So even if I just run through them really quickly, so P is for the power-based traps, and that's when you're involved when you're pursuing power or authority or status or recognition, or you're just following the advice of, as we were talking about, or authorities or experts. Then you've got ego-based.
This is the Future Ready Advisor, a show about transforming your financial advisory practice. I'm your host, Sam Sivarajan, a wealth management consultant, behavioral scientist, and keynote speaker. In this podcast, I dive deep into the real challenges advisors face and bring you insightful conversations with top industry experts. Together, we'll explore practical strategies grounded in behavioral science to help you better serve your clients, optimize your time, and build a future-ready practice. Hi, everyone. I'm Sam Sivarajan, and welcome to the Future Ready Advisor. Today, we're diving into the fascinating world of decision-making, why we sometimes get it wrong, and more importantly, how we can get it right. Today, my guest is Nuala Walsh, a behavioral scientist, accomplished executive, and author of How to Make Smarter Decisions in a Noisy World. With a career spanning finance, strategy, and psychology, she has advised Fortune 500 companies, elite athletes, and even human rights agencies on decision-making and risk perception. She's here to help us uncover the blind spots and deaf spots that trip us up, how to listen strategically, and what financial advisors can do to help their clients and themselves make better choices. Nuala, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much, Sam. Great to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you, and I think this is a particularly timely episode as we're dealing with lots of things that are happening in the world that I think are demanding better, well thought out decisions. So I'm looking forward to our conversation and tips you may have, as I'm sure is our audience.
Terrific.
Now, you've had a fascinating career spanning finance, behavioral science, and decision-making research. I'm curious what led you to write, particularly now, How to Make Smarter Decisions in a Noisy World. And how do you think your background shaped your perspective on decision-making?
It's a great question, Sam, because I spent nearly 30 years in investment banking and asset management. And I guess what I realized over that time is that there's some really smart people and they make really stupid mistakes. And although we know that, what interested me most was the reasons why and what you could do about it. And I went back to school, if you like, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, and I did a master's in behavioural science. And what I was able to do from there was to understand the psychological reasons why people made all of these mistakes and to sort of categorise them. What struck me most was that there was a major gap in the market in terms of how people and how business people thought about decision making. If you're successful, people assume that you've made great decisions, but not necessarily. And I guess what struck me was that the biggest risk that I thought that people faced wasn't necessarily what we talk about all the time, economic, political, or even climate risk, but it was human decision risk and the failure to hear who and what really matters. And in today's world, as you just mentioned, despite all of the advances of the 21st century, the odds really are stacked against good decision making. Because of the speed with which we operate, etc., etc. Very smart people misjudge a lot more, hear a lot less than before, and that leads to unnecessary missed signals and scams, ignored warnings, symbols, everything that we all read about every day in the papers. For me, it was about trying to give people a tool, framework, to think a little bit differently about these predictable errors that people make, and just to make it easier not to get it wrong.
It's a great point. And as you were talking, it occurred to me that when you say that there are very successful people that make decisions and have good outcomes, there is a human tendency to assume that because you did X and the outcome is what you wanted, that one caused the other. And there's a whole bunch of factors that could occur that are outside of your control that might have led to the desired outcome. And we don't necessarily think about that. And the problem is, as you say, that we live in a society where we celebrate success and we assume that success is a natural result. We ignore or sweep under the rug failures, where I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned on failures, because it might not necessarily be that the decision-making process was wrong. Just factors outside of your control cause the outcome to be something other than you wanted.
And as you say that, Sam, I'm thinking of three different biases all at the same time. I'm thinking the first one you talked about was, we assume that it's a good decision because it's a good outcome, and of course that's outcome bias. It's like if you go through a traffic light, is that a good decision or a bad decision? Well, if you reach your destination, you're going to say it's a great decision, but if you knock someone down, it was a bad decision. So it's the same in the sales team. How do you get to your end result? How do you get those sales? Are you cutting corners? You're cutting safety measures? And we know all about the ethical scandals that many companies have entered. And then you talk about it's the false attribution effect. So successful people, think that, well, they credit themselves with these really smart decisions rather than these external factors. And then, of course, you're right into overconfidence. And I think there's a real illusion of invulnerability when you reach the top. So you see it, whether it's politicians, CEOs of companies, presidents. They think that because they've got so far, they'll never fall. And
right.
There are so many examples of people who've just fallen off the wagon, even though they've been incredibly successful for errors of their own doing, or other people have helped bring them down. It's a huge area, and one that doesn't always get enough attention in business, ironically.
Or politics, to your point. And I think we see perhaps some poster childs of decision making that is popular perhaps globally, whether it's in business and all different types of realms that we don't know yet whether it is a good decision or a bad decision, right?
Correct.
Can you share some of the key themes in your book that would resonate with the audience?
Yeah, well, I guess the clue is almost in the title. I mean, the book is called Tune In, and the main reason I've called Tune In is because we are tuned out. And the point is that we tune out the most important voices when it really matters. And, tuning out the most important voices is a huge source of misinformation. But when you learn to actually tune in, it's a source of opportunity. And by the right voices, you could talk about anything from, the voice of conscience, which is obviously a voice of common sense. But too often people just listen to the voice of convenience or ego or comfort. There are many different voices, or the familiarity of certain in-groups. And also people listen to the first voice or the loudest voice or the fastest voice or the most senior voice rather than the right voice. So I've deliberately categorized, as I said, a number of these traps that are based around ego or, lack of identity or, desire for power or, risk-taking that play to all of these errors and lead you to listen to the wrong voices at the wrong time. And unfortunately, there are just far too many examples of people who just get that wrong, which I'm sure we'll come on to. But so what I wanted to do was point out that it's about the context. So the reason that this is a problem that is now getting worse in the world is because there are four factors that harm our decisions. And the first one is that we focus on what we see rather than what we hear, and that's the visual world that we're in. So that could be Instagram or first impressions. We live in a speedy world. We, need to slow down, but we don't. It's a fast-paced, frantic lifestyle. It's data-driven, of course, and this excessive data is so overwhelming that people are struggling to see what's right and what isn't. And then, the fact that we live in a polarized world impacts how we think, and we think in a binary way. Things are right or wrong, or good or bad. Etc. So when we think in this binary way, which it causes us to be narrower in our thinking, and in business, as you well know, people overweight the logical. They don't think about psychology, and they don't think about what's psychological, is what some people say. So there are 200 biases, and of course you're not going to learn all of them or know all of them, but at least appreciating some of them is a step to reinterpreting what you hear or what you don't hear, and avoiding this very predictable rush to misjudgment in this speedy world in which we live in. And I know a lot of my clients at the moment find that these traps are predictable, but when you at least pay attention to them, you have a far greater probability of avoiding this predictable error.
Wow, I love everything that you've just said. And as you were talking, there was two things that struck me. I think your emphasis on the auditory instead of the visual, because we are in a very visual world. And I think what you're talking about strikes me. This is the invisible gorilla experiment, where for our audience who's not aware of it, this is an experiment where they had people watch a video of people passing around a basketball and count the number of times the basketball was passed. In the middle of the experiment, somebody in a gorilla suit walked across the court and beating its chest. And the real finding of this research was that over 50% of people missed the gorilla because they were focused on counting the basketball. And they turned it as inattentional blindness. And I think what you're talking about, Nuala, is sort of an equivalent, inattentional deafness, that we're not paying attention to other signs for all of the things that you talked about, whether it's the loudest voice, whether it's somebody in your group or in group or not. And I think that's a very important point, that we need to kind of not just focus on the visual cues, but the auditory cues as well. The other thing that you said, which really, really struck me, is that the idea that this binary mindset that I think we all have, and this really resonates with me because in business, but I would say even for my audience, special advisors in the financial and wealth management space, too many clients and perhaps a lot of advisors have this very binary view of what success is. So if you have a target return of, for example, of 10% a year, success is, did you get 10%? And failure is anything, less than 10%. But I would say most people that are saving for retirement or other things, knowing that there's a whole host of forces at play, if you got 8% in a particular year, I mean, that doesn't necessarily mean it's failure. It's just it's a different outcome than you expected, and you have to adapt your plan slightly. But I think we face a lot of danger in taking perhaps undue risk if we have a very narrow binary sense of success and our actions.
I think that's absolutely right, and you are right. It is absolutely a case of inattentional deafness, and the whole book is about deaf spots in actual fact. So, and every example cited is about when somebody either didn't listen or misinterpreted what they heard or failed to really hear what was actually being said. So sometimes because people are tuned out to what really matters for all of these different psychological reasons. And deaf ear syndrome is actually something that it's a common psychological problem. And when organizations tune out, reported or actual flaws or problems, that's what researchers call that deaf ear syndrome, and it's everywhere from private equity firms to venture capitalists, to it doesn't matter what industry it is, or even what where you are in the hierarchy. Everybody suffers this, but not enough people, I think, really pay attention to it. And the argument is very much that you can't trust all you hear. And I've developed what I called the trilogy of error, which is really that you've got these psychological blind spots, deaf spots, and dumb spots, because if you stay silent, by definition, other people can't hear what you've got to say, and that is one form of a dumb spot. And again, so these are really, really important criteria, because so it goes back to the Daniel Kahneman idea of, he says what you see is not all there is, and I say, well, what you hear is not all there is, and what you say is not all there is. So the point that really the fundamental point is, and this is something your audience will appreciate, is the need to reinterpret what you hear. And as advisors, to just take what a client says at face value really isn't going to cut it, because people don't always say what they mean. They don't always necessarily understand certain criteria or factors or influences. So it really is up to the advisor to reinterpret what people say. So the book is not about listening. It's absolutely about reinterpreting what people say, because listening is only the first stage. If you listen first, but then you either reinterpret or you don't. And in many cases, reinterpretation is the missing skill in many professions, whether it's financial advice, or whether it's a therapist, whether it's an FBI agent, whether it's a detective. All of these other professions rely on reinterpreting what people say for success, and in many cases what they're paid for. So that's a different point, but it does determine their success in life as well.
And for clarification, Nuala, when you say reinterpret, is it fair to say that you're talking about understanding what the client in this instance says and asking follow-up clarification questions if necessary, digging deeper, reframing, restating what they've said so that you're avoiding any ambiguity or lack of clarity? Is that fair to say?
That is fair to say. It is not taking information at face value. It is probing for inconsistencies, irregularities, listening to doubts or inconsistencies. Absolutely right. It's just going down to a second or third level order of detail rather than just, taking it at that superficial level. Or and asking those follow-up questions.
Yeah, it's interesting as you say it, and I can totally see this applying in almost all walks of life, in daily life. I note more and more that people use terms, and it could be common terms, and I think there is an assumption that there is a shared understanding of what those terms mean. And it's struck me in many recent conversations that there actually isn't that shared understanding of what a term means. So when you're talking about not just listening passively, reinterpreting and probing for inconsistencies, part of it might be to make sure that you're actually using terms like risk or return or volatility or whatever in making sure that you have a shared understanding of what you mean by those terms.
I think that's a really good point, because in many cases people are blinded by euphemisms and acronyms and everything else, and there is that curse of expertise where financial advisors or any professional assumes that the person knows what they're talking about. I mean, you could be getting your house redone, you could have the builder in and they're talking about a particular type of steel, and
Right.
they assume you know exactly what you're talking about. You're thinking, like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
And it's happened to me on several occasions. I have no idea what this person's talking about. But they think, because it's their everyday modus operandi, that of course you know about the difference between type 1 and type 2 steel, or a different type of brick, or a different type of insulation. But of course you don't.
Right.
So it is really important not to, and the other problem is, of course, that you assume that people are experts. So in many cases, you might be working with a lawyer or a doctor, and you think, well, they know their industry, and in many cases they do. But certainly in my world, I have found, to my detriment at times, that in actual fact you should never take the expert always at their word. That you do need to check, you do need to probe, you do need to sometimes get a second opinion when it comes to certain things, depending on the consequentiality of the information and the advice that you're seeking. So this almost glorification of experts, I think is a mistake as well, particularly when other people's lives are at stake, and when you hold power and other people's lives and livelihoods are influenced by your decisions. I think there's a moral responsibility to get decisions right and to not just get it wrong and whoops, sorry about that, because people pay too high a price for your mistakes at times.
Totally agree with that. I've always believed that there is training and experience required. I mean, expertise is something that is gained through training and experience, etc., and there is value in that. That being said, it doesn't remove the obligation of the investor, the patient, or what have you, the voter for that matter, to be empowered and to feel that they also have a vested interest in making sure that they're informed and that they're asking questions and that they're challenging in the right way, etc., than not just accept whatever an expert says, because they're the ones that have to live with the consequences. Now, moving back to the space of financial advice, as we know, financial advisors as experts help clients navigate complex financial choices daily. What would you say are the most common decision, call it death spots, you see in investors, and what strategies do you think that advisors might be able to use to help clients overcome them?
Yeah, I think that's actually a huge question, Sam. And I'll tell you why, because the answer is too big. There are too many of them, which is a bit of a problem, which is why I tried to categorize these problems into the types of traps. So maybe if we take it in two parts. The first bit, what type of traps could they fall into, and then be specifically within that, are there any that are maybe more common than others? And so what I tried to do was, as I said, there are 200 biases.
Yeah.
And what I tried to do was systematize 75 of those into a framework that, that I called the perimeters traps, because there are 10 of them. And that's a mnemonic that symbolizes, how we think in a bounded manner, or how narrowly we think. So each of these traps has 6 or 7 of these predictable biases that advisors might be aware of. And each of those, of course, is a source of misinformation. So even if I just run through them really quickly. So P is for the power-based traps. And that's when you're involved, when you're pursuing power or authority or status or recognition, or you're just following the advice of, as we were talking about, or authorities or experts. Then you've got ego-based traps, which I think we can all probably relate to. Refusal to consider any alternative view because of your own self-importance. You have risk-based traps, which are huge in this space. And maybe we can touch on some of those in a minute. And that it does reflect the client's appetite for sensation seeking and, their intolerance of doubt or uncertainty, but that it's all about the probability neglect and so many others, anchoring, etc. Then you've identity traps, and many clients, wealthy clients, it's all about, their identity and their craving to, in this case, not just curate an image, but to sustain and impress others. So you have an awful lot in that area. Memory-based traps are where clients don't necessarily remember. You might say they really remember their failures, their investment failures, but there is the misinformation effect. There is, the forgetting curve and and the power of suggestion that impact people's decisions there. Ethics-based traps are probably self-evident, and you've got the rogue traders and the scammers here. The time-based traps, the temporal traps, are huge, and these involve living, in the past, the present, or the future, and this is about status quo bias, or not thinking ahead. And we know the problems that people have from an investing perspective or a retirement planning perspective here. Then E is for the emotion-based traps. Again, 27 different emotions. Pick the one, regret, wishful thinking, envy, anger, greed when it comes to investing. Then R is for relationship traps, and that's crowd relationships. And this is all about what your peers have. So in investing, it's the same thing. It's the herding mentality. It's the bandwagon effect. It's social comparison. How many yachts do you have? How many, private jets does someone else have? Never mind, can you just live within your means, or you've got a cost of living crisis in many countries now. So you've got all of these different parameters there. And then the final one, S, are the story-based traps. And this is about how easy an investor or an advisor, how willing they are to accept a narrative of fact without that analysis. And that can be, from conspiracy theories to campaigns to this stock is going to be, the stock of the future. And then you get the bull run on that. So all of these traps come together. And as I say, they are all interrelated. There is a force multiplier effect. So it's almost too easy to say, well, which ones might the advisors fall into? Because the answer is that the advisors fall into all of them, just like their clients do. But the ones that I think that maybe people can think about or look at maybe a little bit more closely are the more obvious ones. For example, overconfidence, I think, is really an easy one to grasp. I think we all know what that one is, but it is a real problem. It is a real problem in this space. The other one is like status quo bias. People don't want to change. People like things as they are. So I've always invested, this amount, and people are unwilling to change their asset allocation strategies because they fear the future. Or you have the herding mentality, which is absolutely huge, as you know. But there are decision rules that people can put in place. But again, the question is, are we talking about the advisor or are we talking about the investor? Because the advisor can put in a wealth of different strategies for the investor, which I'm sure they do, but the actual advisor themselves, it's like anyone in any organization. How liable are they to fall into any of those traps? And the answer is they're liable to fall into each one of those. And for me, if I was an investor looking for an advisor, I would be looking for an advisor that had an advanced behavioural skill set. So sometimes the understanding of human behaviour can be just too superficial. Until they understand the psyche of their clients, and I'm sure many do or try to at least, I think that they are putting themselves at risk and also putting their clients at risk.
Yeah, I love that framework, and I couldn't agree with you more that these set of traps are trying to isolate one of them is futile, because they're all probably operating simultaneously and not just for advisors and clients. I think you've seen the research that says that professionals are as susceptible to behavioral biases as lay people. There's the famous study, of course, in this space that professional fund managers, if you ask them, 90% of them believe that they're better than average, which we know is a statistical impossibility. So it's not that having professional training makes you less susceptible to biases or traps. I think your advice is a good one, that as clients or as investors probably should be looking for somebody who's got an awareness of the biases or traps, and the fact that there isn't this hubris that they're somehow immune to it themselves, right? That they're putting processes, safeguards, awareness, etc., in place to limit the impact of these traps, not just on clients, but on themselves.
I think that's right. And it goes back to where we started. When people are successful, and many fund managers are successful until they aren't, and that's the problem. It's a bit late when you've fallen off the wagon and you've underperformed. But you can mitigate these, and it's not only by putting in technological safeguards, but it's the other round. I mean, it's very difficult, if you're underperforming, for example, and your peer is performing. And I saw this a lot when I was working in investments. The underperforming fund managers really, really suffer, and they take it a lot worse. So to get their confidence back up again, to do well for their clients, can be very, very difficult. So that's a combination of ego bias, but it's also identity. I mean, so all of those traps, the identity traps, come into play there hugely. And there's a little bit also maybe about the relationship traps in terms of this, the social comparison. And we know that, comparison is the thief of joy. And in that world, you really do only compare yourself to your peers because it's so well rewarded as well. So, there are high stakes, not just from a client perspective, but from a personal perspective as well. And sometimes people make these decisions with the business lens rather than with a moral lens, because people become so desperate to gain the awards again and to be, the fund manager in demand.
Yeah, it's an important point. And I think, as you say, if maybe I can just visit this theme a bit, you talked about the fact that we seem to associate success as achieving the right outcome when so much of that is outside of our control. How much can you talk a little bit about the idea, particularly from your perspective, that getting the process right is perhaps more important than the outcome? Because anything can happen to get a good or a bad outcome in one particular instance. But if you've got a robust enough process that you are making, in your words, a better decision, than an objectively better decision than perhaps what the outcome itself might show.
Yeah, and it's interesting when you use the word process. Are we talking about the investment process, which of course I wouldn't dream of opining on? So there's an investment process, and then there's a decision-making process, and sometimes you might think the two are the same thing, but they're actually not. So, and this is why I say that within any high-stakes situation, to what extent does any board really focus on upgrading their decision-making skills? And there is a study by, I think it's Dan Lavallo and one of his colleagues at Harvard, that basically say that the importance of the decision-making process is, has a multiple of 6 in terms of its impact on revenue. So again, focusing on the decision-making process. But it's very hard to say you get your decision-making process right. I'm not sure that, I think even if you were to make it as simple as, Sam, when you're making a decision, so if I was investing, which of these reasons, are any of these reasons impacting my decision? So let's just say we're on the risk-based factors, and we didn't get to talk about those, but you've got anchoring, and we know what anchoring is in terms of, relying on the first number you hear. And I've always had a 10% return, so I must have a 10% return, and anything less than that is failure.
Right.
And that happens in negotiations. You also have probability neglect. Well, the probability of me always getting 10% is a bit unlikely. So we neglect the probability either too high or too low with different things. So there are an awful lot of these risk-based factors that come into play as well. And then, of course, you've got sunk cost, the sunk cost fallacy. Well, I've invested this much, I might as well keep going. And that's not just for investors, but there are an awful lot of factors in that. So if you were to ask yourself as an investor or as the advisor, which of these traps are we more likely to fall into? I think you find that there were a lot more than you think, because there are 75, but if you say, well, we're most vulnerable to the risk-based traps, or certainly the ego-based traps, what is happening in here, and am I making this decision really for the best interest of my client, or is it really just about me, or I want to be seen to be the number one financial advisor and to win the awards and get the best return. So I think when you probe the reasons as to why you're making certain decisions, that should become part of the process. And it isn't part of the process at all. Because I go back to the original argument, which is we're in a hurry. We are at a greater risk of tuning out and these right voices and the voice of conscience and everything else. But we live in it's too fast. We don't slow down. We don't slow down long enough to even think about these things, because there's always the next crisis, and there's always the next deadline, or the next client, or the next phone call, or the next meeting to go to. So what I did in the book was, there is a big argument to talk about slowing down slightly. I mean, none of us are going to slow down completely, but a strategic slowness, so that you do reinterpret more and you do tune in more, second guess, ask these questions and question answers, as you were talking about earlier on. But when people are confident enough to pause and ask for more time, I think you're doing yourself and your client a favor, because at the end of the day, you have to control your own cognitive bandwidth, because the brain just has a limited capacity to take on all the information that we're just being bombarded with. And it's not fair on either the advisor or on the investor to expect them, to take it all in when life is so distracting. But these huge sums are involved, and people's lives and livelihoods and legacies are involved. As I said, I think the onus is on people to do that within the workplace, and also then, I guess, to bring their healthiest self to the office and to the decision-making table, so that they, prioritise this deep work and set aside dedicated time for strategic thinking. And in my day, we never did it. The only time you had to think strategically was at the weekend in your spare time, or if you happened to go on an off-site. I mean, you just couldn't do it during the day.
No, you're absolutely right. To your point, we live in a high-speed world. And so this process, this thinking is very important. Now, realistically, we're not going to be able to do that, and nor should we be doing that to say, do I want a latte or a cappuccino this morning? You're talking about decisions that have broader impact. To me, that strikes me that there are ways to do it, and we need to feel ourselves empowered. I mean, this is the age-old kind of take a beat kind of mindset. But one of the things that I used to do is that I get a meeting or something that has happened with a client or with a colleague, and immediately you're full of emotion and you want to draft an email or a response, and that can be very dangerous. I learned that one of the most beneficial practices that I did was that I would go and pound away at my keyboard and draft an email, and I would never have the to address filled in, and it would stay in my draft. And there was a conscious effort on my point to say that, yes, I can put my thoughts down, but it's not going out for at least 24 hours. And I think that was a very basic way of trying to slow things down, as you said. And the other thing, and I think particularly for financial advisors, we have to give ourselves permission to not answer right away. So I was a corporate lawyer early in my career, and I remember my mentor gave me a piece of advice that I thought was quite compelling. He said, people think that your job is that the client asks you something and that you're supposed to rhyme off cases or parts of the law, citing section numbers and everything else, etc. He said, that's not it at all. I think he says quite often he would tell clients, that's an interesting point. I think I know the answer to that, but I need to dig into it a little bit more. I promise to come back to you in 24 hours with an answer. And I think as advisors or as decision makers, we need to start empowering ourselves to feel comfortable to be able to say, you know what, I think I have an answer to what you're asking, but I want to think about it a little bit more and give you a more nuanced answer. Can I call you tomorrow?
Do you know, I think that's great advice, Sam. It really is. And I think, but that requires A, maybe an element of maturity, and B, an element of confidence. And I think it's only when you feel very comfortable in your own skin that I think you will do that. Otherwise it's that rush to must answer, must look good. And, and it goes back to the ego. I feel I have to look like the smartest person in the room. So therefore I have to answer this person and justify the exorbitant fees I'm probably charging my client, for such advice.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think both of those are bang on. I think that it is maturity and experience and, learning from what not to do. But I think confidence, humility, all of those things. And this is where I love your characterization of those traps. I think ego, I think identity, all of those things play a role into it. And I think, there is no algorithm or easy way to solve this. I think probably the first part is simply being aware that these things exist and that you, along with everyone else in this world, are susceptible to it.
It's a hard nut to crack, to be fair, but I think it's one that there's almost the responsibility is there for people to do it. So it's just, hopefully more people will do it rather than not.
Nuala, if there was one big takeaway you would want readers, listeners, I should say, and readers of your book, especially financial professionals, to remember, what would it be?
It's probably just that last point that people's decisions really matter. And sometimes we don't, whatever job we hold, we don't realize how important our decision is to somebody else. Now, you might think, of course, as an advisor that, well, you know that, but the ramifications of your decision really do permeate for a long, long time, particularly for financial advisors. And so for me, I think that onus is on those people who hold power to decide responsibly, morally, and to investigate all the anomalies. And by tuning in, to the right voices and rising above that noise and understanding these traps, I think financial professionals can make much smarter decisions that lead to success all around, not just for their clients, but also for themselves, because they will stand out in their industry. They will stand out as people who understand behaviour a lot more than the average person. So go back to your earlier point, people think they're above average in everything. People think they're smarter, people think they don't have many biases. And that's because once they know about them, that they're able to control them. So I think that they will give themselves a personal advantage by just asking more questions and questioning more answers.
I really like that. Asking more questions and questioning more answers. I really like that. I think that's great. Well, we're coming to the end of our podcast, so I have a few final rapid fire questions that I ask all my guests. So if you're ready.
Okay.
Number one, professionally, what is the most important lesson you've learned over the years?
I'm probably not going to answer it in a straightforward way because I think the answer has changed based on whatever level I was at. So I think whatever lesson I thought was amazingly important when I started certainly wasn't at the end.
Right.
So there isn't one that has carried the whole way through. And for me, I don't think there are silver bullets. And it's about not oversimplifying, by having just the one or the most important lesson, because there are too many.
Well, I think that's also a fair answer, right? What I take away from that is that, look, we're all evolving. And, I think our priorities or the lessons to be learned at a particular age and stage of your life may be different than the lesson to be learned at a different stage in your life. Number two, if you had to give one piece of advice to listeners on making smarter decisions for themselves and their clients, what would it be?
I would probably go with something that, I do say to my clients, and that is, and it goes back to this point about tuning in and tuning out. And it's probably summarized with something like, not everything you hear is valuable and not everything valuable is heard. And your role is to make sure the latter, that everything valuable is heard and that people hear you as well.
Oh, that's great. That's great advice. Oh, this is great. It's been a really, really fascinating conversation. If listeners want to learn more about you or find your work, where do they go?
Well, if it's about tune in, they can obviously go to Amazon and pick it up there. Otherwise, I'm on LinkedIn, or my business website is Mind Equity, and it's mindequity.co.uk, or alternatively, just go to nualagwalsh.com. And there's plenty of contact and articles and information there as well.
And I'll share all of this in the show notes to this episode. This has been fantastic, Nuala. I thank you for joining us today on the Future Ready Advisor.
Thank you very much, Sam. It's been fun. Thank you.
Episode of the Future Ready Advisor, I spoke with behavioral scientist and author Nuala Walsh about the hidden forces shaping our decisions. and how financial advisors can help clients make smarter choices in a noisy world. Here are my 3 key takeaways. Number 1, tuning in beats tuning out. Nuala argues that in our fast-paced, data-heavy world, we often miss the most important signals, not because we can't see them, but because we don't hear them. Advisors need to tune in to what's really being said and not said, reinterpreting client language to uncover true motivations and risks. Number 2, bias is a shared burden. Clients and advisors alike fall prey to cognitive traps, from overconfidence to herd mentality. Nuala's perimeters framework helps categorize these traps and reminds us that awareness is the first stage. Success isn't about avoiding all mistakes. It's about building processes that reduce their frequency and impact. And number 3, process trumps outcome. Good results don't always mean good decisions. In high-stakes environments, robust decision-making processes, not gut instinct or speed, are what truly differentiates great advisors. Asking better questions, slowing down when it matters, and listening beyond the obvious can be a game changer. As Nuala put it, not everything valuable is heard. Let's change that. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Future Ready Advisor. You've been listening to the Future Ready Advisor. If you enjoyed the show, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts or a rating on Spotify, or share your feedback wherever you listen. Be sure to follow the podcast so you never miss an episode. For more insights on how to keep your practice future ready, visit www.samsivarajan.com. You can find the link on the show notes. There you'll find free tools and resources, along with exclusive bonus content from these podcasts. Thanks for tuning in, and I look forward to sharing more strategies with you in the next episode.